In Essential Task 1.9, we are going to be talking about what I call special topics in memory. So far in Essential Task 1.7, we've identified the steps involved in memory, from that first sensory register with sensory memory, to the encoding process and the connection with short-term memory, storage, sometimes called long-term memory, and then the retrieval process. Then in Essential Task 1.8, we overviewed the different forms of long-term memory, dividing it up into explicit and implicit memory. In Essential Task 1.9, we are going to be talking about some of the unique features involved in memory, some of the unique types of memory, and then eventually talking about what's called the misinformation effect. So again, I think this concept map can be done horizontal or vertical, as indicated with the essential task. We are only going to concept map the 4 boxes on the screen. So I'll return now back to the essential task text, where you only have to copy down again what is in yellow. And again, you can decide whether you want to do it horizontal or vertical. We're going to start our concept map all the way on the left and identify 2 types of memory that do not fit in any of the categories that we've established so far, at least not perfectly. And the very first is what we call flashbulb memories. Flashbulb memories are technically episodic memories, but they're episodic memories for incredibly dramatic events. So, for example, for my generation, September 11th is an example of a flashbulb memory. I can tell you in great detail, even though I think it was only in 5th grade, what happened that day. I even can remember and envision in my mind walking into my home that day because my middle school hadn't told us what happened. I remember walking into my house that day, looking up the stairs and seeing my mom. She was kind of standing right in front of the TV in the kitchen. And I can really, even to this day, remember the interaction I've had with her. For our or your generation, the Boston Marathon bombing might be a good example of a flashbulb memory. Incredibly dramatic event, and you might remember in great detail what you were doing, precisely what time of the day it was, whether you were with friends, whether you were playing Xbox, whether you were at a dance recital, whatever it might be. Maybe you're even watching the marathon at home. Those are examples of episodic memories, so events of your life that have such a strong emotional connection that they are unlikely over time to decay, which is a word that we're going to talk about in the next task. Decay is a word that we use for forget. As long as you live, as long as I live, we'll remember 9/11, the Boston Marathon bombing. If you ask somebody who's old enough, other events like the JFK assassination or the MLK assassination would be other examples of flashbulb memories. So these are episodic memories that have such a intense, dramatic nature that they simply do not decay over time. The other type of memory, or at least term that has the word memory attached to it, and this one really doesn't fit well into the other categories, is a term that I actually use quite a lot in class. It's called prospective memory. Prospective memory is a term that we use for events that you plan on doing in the future. So you have not done them. However, you've told yourself in the future you plan on doing them. So, for example, maybe you need to print something out before you go to school. Maybe as you're sitting in class, you choose not to write down a homework assignment, but you tell yourself that when you go home, you will do it. Maybe at work, you're in the middle of a really quick shift or a shift that's really fast paced, and you tell yourself, I need to take the trash out before we move on to the next part of work, or I need to make sure I change the coffee out of the coffee machine. Memory for future events is what we call prospective memory, and hopefully most of the time, you in fact remember to do those actions. If you tell yourself on the way home from school today, I am going to stop at the bank, and you fail to stop at the bank, that is a good example of your prospective memory failing you. As a mnemonic, if you're familiar with the word prospective, it simply means likely to happen in the future. If you're familiar with sports, a lot of the time younger players are called prospects because they're young and you don't know if they're going to develop into a superstar, but it's possible, so they're considered prospects at that time. If you identify and isolate the word prospect, you can use that as a mnemonic because we're talking about prospective memory. Memory, again, for things in the future. I will very frequently, as the year progresses, use the word prospective when talking about assignments. It'll be common for me to say things like, make sure in your prospective memory, you have to submit your concept maps or your upcoming online multiple choice or various other assignments that we will encounter as the year progresses. Opposing those 2 forms of memory that don't really fit perfectly into any of the other previous categories that we've talked about is what we call construction of memory. This might be one of the first times that we've seen this different icon. It is a green key icon. This icon represents key psychologists. Elizabeth Loftus is a great example of a key psychologist. She's been studying memory now for decades. She's still around and active in the field of memory as a cognitive psychologist. That key icon indicates that there's a higher probability that her name appears on the AP exam than some of the others that we've described. Loftus is important for a few different reasons. The biggest contribution that I envision appearing on the AP exam is what's called the misinformation effect. There was a short YouTube video. It's just a few-minute clip of a TED Talk that I'd like you to watch. Again, you can, if you access the Prezi itself, click this link. That YouTube video will be attached to the Google Classroom link where this video will be located. But I will zoom in so you can see exactly how much you need to watch. I'm only asking you to watch from about the 5-minute mark to the 6:30 mark. In that clip, she is going to describe some of her experiences with the misinformation effect. It's actually a little bit longer, 5 to, looks like a little bit past 8 minutes. The misinformation effect in her research in memory all sort of circles around the idea that your memory works a lot more like a Wikipedia page than it does a recorder. That's actually a line that she commonly uses. And that particularly at the moment of questioning, and this is really important from a criminal justice perspective, if somebody asks you misleading information, we have found that it is very easy to pollute your memory, specifically of an episodic memory. So, for example, if you were the witness to a crime, it's very easy for certain types of misleading information to be presented to you and have that totally pollute your recollection of the event. And it's so pivotal from a criminal justice perspective that someone can actually be incredibly confident in their recollection of an event, but because of misleading information, can totally distort the actual accuracy of that event. When you watch the clip attached to the left, you will see Loftus describe a study that she conducted where she showed a simulated car crash to a series of participants. And then in the aftermath of that, she asked them a series of questions. In those series of questions, she asked how fast were the cars moving in that simulated accident. But what's unique about this is that different participants heard that question differently. Some were asked, at what speed did those cars contact? Others heard, at what speed did those cars hit or bump or collide or smash? And depending on the verb choice from contact all the way to smash, the average estimated speed differed by almost 10 miles per hour. You can see this table to the right, just above her picture, indicating that although everybody witnessed the same simulated car crash, changing one single word in the question can distort the recollection of the event. And if you're going 31 in a school zone, you're still going over the speed limit. You would still definitely get in trouble if there's some type of accident. Going 41 though, that's a big deal. That's a much more serious offense. And a 10 mile per hour difference in estimations can be entirely attributed to that one single word. Individuals in that scenario exhibited the misinformation effect. There's two connecting terms that relate not only to the criminal justice field, but also the misinformation effect. And the first is what we call free recall. It is way more ideal to ask somebody really open-ended questions when you're trying to gauge their memory of an episodic event. So, for example, if you were the witness to an accident or to some type of crime, a police officer or whoever should ask you really general, broad, open-ended questions. What did you see? That way, you have no influence whatsoever. There's no possibility of the misinformation effect. When you are asked to do something and sort of freely remember whatever it is that you happen to recall or retrieve, you're using what's called free recall. There's no what we call retrieval cues. A retrieval cue is sort of a hint or an indication of the direction that you might go in. Many open response questions have this element to them. Certainly the question itself might give you some hints with the context. However, most free response questions that you'll encounter throughout your academic career are generally free recall. You usually have to pull a lot of information from your long-term memory through the retrieval process. Hopefully you have that stuff stored away. And the same is true in the criminal justice field. You should do a lot more free recall when asking somebody to remember an event, as opposed to providing them these cues. If you add at what speed do the cars collide or crash, you're kind of indicating speed just with your description, and that can influence their response. Recognition is sort of a secondary term here. A lot of times in the criminal justice field, you might encounter sort of a lineup. If everybody was in class, I would actually do some type of demonstration of this. But one of the reasons why those picture lineups, where you try to identify the criminal, can sometimes be ineffective is our memory, as Loftus says in her video, works a lot more like a Wikipedia page. It's not always perfect. And oftentimes, when given the question of recognizing something, you can often choose the closest as opposed to the true actual case. A major change in the past several decades, in many ways because of Loftus's work, is that when you do a picture lineup, you actually have to tell the individual the criminal or the potential suspect might not be in this. That way, they do not feel inclined to pick the individual that looks the closest to what they saw from their memory or what they can recall from their memory. When an individual is asked to identify somebody in a lineup, they're exhibiting recognition, which is very prone to the misinformation effect. The final thing we're going to talk about is the box all the way to the bottom right. This is right below the misinformation effect, and it's called constructive memory. When you are asked to recall an event, it's very plausible that you experience constructive memory, where you actually believe your memory of the event to be true. However, whether it's due to the misinformation effect, so some type of misleading question, or the fact that we tend to just sort of fill in gaps in our memory with what we might anticipate or believe happened, as opposed to what definitively did happen, we can experience these phenomena where you have someone who is 100% positive, this is exactly what I saw, but is partially or even in some cases entirely incorrect. This is one of the main reasons why eyewitness testimony is very susceptible to issues with memory. There's an entire organization, the Innocence Project, that really works hard with trying to overturn cases where shaky eyewitness testimony was used as the number one defining factor in cases of guilt